This is Jonny Gould's Jewish State.
People may find this a little far-fetched, but I think of Israel as potentially the last man or person standing in the West. Because if you look at the West, it is literally dying on its feet. Look at the birth rate. Basically, it is below replacement rate in many countries in Western Europe and in America. Whereas Israel, 3-point-something children per woman, including in secular Tel Aviv. And, this is a country, in Israel, it's a country which is optimistic. It actually believes it has a future. And so its birth rate is booming. Its economy, it's booming. Its happiness index is very, very high. This is extraordinary.
Melanie Phillips was once a committed diaspora Jew pledged to improving life in the UK. Moving to Israel was just simply not on her radar. Why would it be when we lived in the Golden Mediener in Yiddish, a golden country where Jews could live and prosper? Today, she's an arch-Zionist, living mostly in Jerusalem with her husband, the BBC's former legal affairs correspondent, Joshua Rozenberg. This episode chronicles Melanie's transition and uses her story to illustrate what's been happening to Anglo Jewry since the end of World War II.
Now, I spent most of my life thinking that it was an absolute sacred duty to be a diaspora Jew, that we had a duty to be a light unto nations, to spread Jewish values. But I've changed my view, to put it mildly, and I now believe that in Britain, Jews are, as they always have been, there on sufferance.
Melanie says she was mugged by reality in her book Guardian Angel. Inheriting strong Jewish values, she had a monumental fallout with her Guardian colleagues who she thought were on the same side as her, but realised in a moment they weren't. Melanie Phillips brings powerful intellect and insight to her social commentary, and this podcast is dedicated to the story of changing tides which face Jews not just here in the UK, but in the whole of the Western world. There's adventures on BBC TV political shows, and she's written a novel. Apparently, this is the first Jewish media that's got anywhere near mentioning it. Stay here for Melanie Phillips and subscribe to her work at melaniephillips.substack.com. Melanie Phillips, welcome to Jonny Gould's Jewish State.
Hello, Jonny. Very nice to be with you.
It is very nice to have you with us today. Now, you've had a very long and distinguished writing career, and what's so interesting about it is the stream of consciousness existing throughout it, through the most extraordinary times of change. And of course, we can find the latest of your columns and writings at melaniephillips.substack.com. Phillips, of course, with a double L. But you're quite different now to where you were perhaps in the 1980s.
No, I'm really the same cuddly person that I always was. It's just that everybody else has changed. No, that's not quite true. To stop being facetious for a moment, there's part of me that changed radically and part of me that didn't change radically. What changed radically, what didn't change, is the ideals that I had when I was a young journalist working for The Guardian. And those ideals remain my ideals. And they were basically to stand up for truth against lies, for the disempowered against the powerful, to stand up against abuses of power, and to follow the evidence wherever it led. And those ideals remain my ideals. What changed radically was that starting when I was at The Guardian, the people that I believed were on my side for truth against lies, for right against wrong, for justice against injustice, for the oppressed against the oppressor, for anti-racism, to coin the current phrase, against racism. All those people that I thought were on my side were on the other side. That was the shattering discovery that I made, or the conclusion that I came to, and that changed everything for me. It took a period of time because it was like finding your family as a family of serial abusers. You can't really believe it, and they're still your family. So it took me a while to disengage. And it took me longer for me to disengage from the left than it took the left to disengage from me. It took the left approximately 12 hours to disengage from me.
The first column that I wrote, the second column that I wrote at The Guardian, was the first column that I wrote that almost overnight, it was about education. And overnight, I became right-wing. And at that stage, I couldn't understand what was going on. So I've changed considerably, but in the most important respects, I've not changed.
As Brendan O'Neill told me in an earlier episode of Johnny Gould's Jewish State, I haven't deserted the left. The left has deserted me. And my word, for a guy who called himself a revolutionary Marxist in the 1980s, I find it quite difficult to disagree with him on many fundamental issues. There was an extraordinary where I pushed the envelope towards the end of the interview. I wanted to see what he thought about Margaret Thatcher selling off council houses in the 1980s, which I called the greatest social act of progress in Britain in my lifetime. I saw it with my own eyes as a tallyman in Walsall in the West Midlands, and those houses were looked after. And of course, lo and behold, he came from a home like that in Burnt Oak. So it's an extraordinary thing to find that in this sort of paradigm of left and right, Margaret Thatcher, some of her ideals of the individual being empowered seem to be what he believed in as a Marxist in the 1980s. I'm really struggling with these
Yes.
identities now.
Well, I have a lot of time for Brendan O'Neill and for other writers for the Spiked website, but they are confusing. Because, as you say, they started out as Marxists and now they're Thatcherites. And this is one of the curiosities. I mean, you see, I was never a Thatcherite. That is to say, I'm not a Thatcherite now. I believed at the time, and I still believe, that she was a very great person, that she did various things which were absolutely essential to get Britain going. And the most important thing, in my view, that she represented and embodied was the belief in Britain as a nation. She wanted to end the demoralization of the country, which in her view had caused it to go into a period of constant decline and defeatism. And I thought that was admirable at the time, and I still think that was one of her most important contributions. But she stood for a way of thinking which I think is still a fault line in the Conservative Party, because it's not conservative. To me, being conservative is to conserve what is of inestimable value in our society. And to that end, a lot of people who have always voted for the Labour Party, the famous Red Wall constituents in the north of England, for example, they are social conservatives. They believe in conserving the nation, its values, their way of life. Now, there's a great strain in the Conservative Party, which was embodied by Mrs. Thatcher, which is more what used to be called Manchester liberalism. It's the espousal of the free market as being the unalloyed good that will change everything for the better. And it seemed to me at the time, and I wrote this at the time, when I was already persona non grata on the left, but I wrote it at the time, that Mrs. Thatcher's way of thinking, which was a kind of free market liberalism, lined her up, in fact, with the left, because the banner they all marched behind was liberty. Now, liberty is very important, but as a means to an end. And it seemed to me that both the so-called conservatives, the free market liberal conservatives like Mrs. Thatcher, and elements on the left were making freedom into an end in itself. The left, on the left, it took the form of social policy. So, lifestyle choice. Everyone's sexual arrangement was the same value as everyone else's, that sort of thing. Like I'm libertarian. And on the right, in the so-called Conservative Party, it took the form of economic liberalism. I got the impression, and I wrote this at the time, and I've never changed my view, that Mrs. Thatcher seemed to think that if the entire world was run like Marks and Spencer, everything would be great. And what she didn't understand, and I think she began to understand it towards the end of her premiership, was the cultural revolution that was underway at the time in the institutions of the country, particularly the universities and the schools. She got to the schools bit quite late on, but even then she didn't really understand, in my view, what was the magnitude of what was going on. The whole onslaught on the family, the traditional family, the onslaught on the very concept of the nation. she didn't understand that because she was marching behind this banner of liberty. And I think we still see that fault line today. And I was never of that ilk. And I still am not. I'm somebody who believes in social responsibility. I believe, in helping to make a better society by empowering the good that people do rather than the bad. And the good that people do means looking after each other, putting other people's interests first, putting your children's interests before your own. You cannot have a society run on the basis of selfishness, which remains a cohesive society committed to anything resembling decent values. Now, I've always thought that, and I still think that. And that puts me at odds with a very significant portion of the Conservative Party. So I find myself in the extraordinary position, and we can talk about some of the issues that relate to this, but I find myself in the extraordinary position now of being simultaneously under attack from the left as being a far-right neo-fascist, and from the right as going back to my Guardianista roots simultaneously. This is a very perplexing position to be in.
Well, we'll talk about that within the Jewish paradigm, because I'm sort of fitting the horseshoe there that you're talking about. But I did eventually, just pegging back, I did get Brendan eventually to balk during our interview when I presented him with the idea of being a Thatcherite. He was at that point that I finally got him to that no, and he described it in exactly the same way that you did, that the economic and social differences. So maybe we'll see you in Spiked very, very soon. Who knows? Should we just go back into your Jewish background, which, a bit like mine, is of a time that has gone. It's flown. And I mourn it in the sense that it was so rich and so lovely. Grandparents from, all four corners of Europe, in my case, they fled Vienna. My grandfather fled the First World War in what is now the Ukraine, was Poland and Russia as a child. My grandfather was born in Birmingham. I am, to all intents and purposes, a fourth generation Brummie. Whereas on the mother's side, I am, a second generation Englishman, because they came from Vienna. So, I know all about that stupid prejudice within the Jewish community amongst people, because my mum even talked about it, about the new immigrants who came, and you hear about the Spanish and the Portuguese in 1492 and 1497, and it's the same old, same old. So just tell us a little bit about your background, because I think you're from Hammersmith originally, right?
Yes. I was born and bred in Hammersmith in West London, and lived most of my life until about 20 years ago in West London. My parents both were born in Britain. My mother's grandparents immigrated to Britain from Belarus, as it's now called, and my father's parents immigrated from Poland, so he was one generation back. And I had a very typical of its time upbringing in Hammersmith. They settled in Hammersmith for various reasons. And we belonged to a United Synagogue Orthodox synagogue in Hammersmith. And at the time, West London had quite a large Jewish community. And over time, over the I suppose 20 or 30 years after I was born in 1951, the Jewish community basically left West London and migrated to northwest London. But my parents stayed behind in Hammersmith until they died. And they never had any money at all, except that, they had some money, all of which they spent on my education. I was privately educated. I was an only child. But they had no savings ever and died virtually penniless. And they lived in the same rented apartment that they'd always lived in. My father sold women's clothes from a van. My mother ran a shop selling children's clothes. They were very uneducated, but they were intelligent. But they were uneducated. My father had left school at, 14 in the East End. He'd had, a classic East End upbringing, 6 of them in one room, no food, no work. we were not Sabbath observant. We were not Shomer Shabbat, but we were kosher at home and out. And it was in that sense a very typical British Jewish upbringing. And Israel just didn't figure. Israel was a country which we all kind of supported, and we were pleased that it was there. But it was for Jews not like us. Why? It was for Jews who needed it. Why didn't we need it? Because we were in the Golden and Medina. We were in one of the best environments for Jews ever. Britain was so good to us, we thought. We were so grateful to it, we told ourselves, for having taken us collectively in, and for treating us so well, because the British, unlike the more excitable continentals in mainland Europe, were absolutely stoical and phlegmatic. They were, as people, the British were as grey and damp as the weather. And that was our security. That was our safety. And so why on earth would we even think of going anywhere else? So Israel never figured in my mind. It wasn't a Zionist family. When I was a teenager, I attended a Zionist youth organization, but it was more a kind of for social reasons than ideological reasons. And indeed, the kind of Zionist propaganda we were subjected to turned me off completely, because I was very contrasuggestive, and I thought, well, I'm not going to be told how to think. And so it never figured in my mind until 1982, which we can talk about if you want.
Yes. Is that the Lebanon War, or
Yes.
an incident in your life?
It was an incident in my life. It was against the background of the Lebanon War.
And Shlomo Argov's attempted assassination, presumably.
Yes. When I was at The Guardian, I think I joined The Guardian in, I think it was 1979. So I hadn't been there for very long, but I was already a Guardian leader writer, which was a wonderful job, because it was like going back to my Oxford educational days. It was like being in an Oxford college. The colleagues in the leader room were so civilized. They were so educated. They were so wonderful in every respect. And I just was absolutely in heaven until I wasn't. And what happened was that the Lebanon War happened. And as I said, Israel wasn't really on my radar. But I was very aware immediately in 1982, when the Lebanon War happened, that something terrible had crawled out of the woodwork in Britain about Jews, because the Lebanon War at that stage, that particular war was controversial. I wasn't sure what I thought about it. I thought Israel had behaved rashly in going too far into Lebanon and whatever. But I understood that the reason they'd gone in was defensive. Every Israel war is defensive. And they'd gone in to root out the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was a source of terrorism in Israel. But out of the woodwork came the motif of the Israeli Jew as the Nazi. Ariel Sharon was the Nazi. And Israel's defensive war was portrayed as an act of wanton aggression. And they were kind of portrayed as bloodthirsty killers of the innocent. And this knocked me for six. And simultaneously, this was accompanied by unashamed anti-Semitism. Anyone who was Jewish was accused of, but you all stick together, as if we're all kind of suddenly lumped together because of this war that had nothing to do with us, because we were British Jews. And the thing that happened at The Guardian, which changed my life, or started the change in my life, was when one day I said to them, I was perplexed why The Guardian was dwelling so much on the Lebanon War, why any kind of killing of the Palestinians was the subject of a front page splash story, outraged editorials, apoplectic op-eds, whereas Assad, the father of the current President Assad of Syria, caused the death over a short period of time, a couple of weeks maybe, of anything between 10 and 40,000 of his opponents. And it was a routine foreign story in the back of the paper. And I said, we appear to have a double standard. Why is that? And it was as if I had crossed a line. I knew immediately I'd crossed a line. The entire leader room looked at me in amazement and said, of course there's a double standard. How can there not be a double standard? We in the West are brought up to have respect for human life and human rights. People in Syria are not brought up to have that kind of attitude. We can't judge people in Syria or anywhere in the developing world by our standards. That's racism. And I said, are you kidding me? You mean if you're unfortunate enough to be born into a society which doesn't care about human life, but which is killing you, then your life isn't worth what our lives are worth? To me, that's racism. And then they said, why are you so upset? We do you. And I became you at that point. I'd previously been we. I now became you. We do you the great honor of believing that you and we are all on the same moral page. And what's more, you tell us that you are morally superior to us. And at that moment, I realized that the people I thought were on my side were not on my side, that they purported to be anti-racist, but they were deeply anti-Jewish and prejudiced. And not just prejudiced against Jews, but prejudiced against the developing world. They viewed people from the developing world as less deserving of human rights than they were. And from that moment, I realized that they were on the other side to me. And that kind of opened a door through which I walked and started to look at stuff in Britain that was going on in Britain to do with education, family, and all those issues, the nation, multiculturalism, all those things. I started to judge by completely different yardsticks and realized as I went on that what I had gleaned in those encounters in 1982 was a kind of foretaste of the fact that they were really on the other side. And another thing that happened in 1982 was that they made it clear to me that because I was taking this view, and I'd never been to Israel at that point, never wanted to go, but because I was taking the view that there was a fundamental unfairness, imbalance, disproportionate nature of this reporting, I was no longer British. They regarded me as no longer British. And this was made clear to my face. And so that set in train this whole, change of attitude that I had. And then that whole Israel thing went underground in my mind. I was busy with many other things, and it surfaced again in 2000 with the Intifada.
Did they physically actually say you don't reflect British values, or you're just not British in the way that we understand it?
There was one particular thing that happened at that time. One of the chief leader writer at The Guardian made a remark to me which was intensely revealing in this respect. There was a short period in that year in which Israel was still at war in the Lebanon. Britain had gone to war in the Falklands against the Argentine invasion. And at The Guardian, we were absolutely consumed by the Argentine adventure. It was a matter of the most intense controversy, whether Mrs. Thatcher was trying to sort of emulate, Gladstone's gunboats or whatever, Palmerston's gunboats, or whatever it was, and, was trying to sort of relive the British Empire, or whether she was acting properly to defend British individuals in the Falklands. And it consumed us, this great controversy that was going on within The Guardian. It's what we all thought about the whole time. And one day I met but the Lebanon war was still going on. And in this period of crossover, I encountered the chief leader writer who said to me as follows: Melanie, what on earth are we going to say about your war? And he did not mean the Falklands. My war. All because I had simply questioned the disproportionate and venomous coverage of Israel in the Lebanon. But the Falklands was no longer my war. I was no longer British. And that attitude, it wasn't said to me in such graphic terms, but it was made quite clear. And in fact, I went to a debate, I think this was after 2000. It was a debate run, as I recall, by The Economist. And in the course of that debate, it was about the Middle East. In the course of that debate, somebody got up, the proposer of the motion or the whatever it was, the main speaker, and said the British Jewish community has got a problem because unless they disavow Israel, we should no longer consider them to be British. And everybody just nodded. Everybody nodded along. And, there have been crude things like that, but which are unambiguous. But after my encounters at The Guardian in the early 1980s, I came across this attitude a lot, but expressed more obliquely, but making it quite clear that there was something very un-British about supporting Israel. You couldn't support Israel as a Jew and be British. And of course, this is, a unique position for the Jewish community. No other community is presented with this ultimatum that, your view of another country influences whether or not you're actually British, considered to be British. And it's this, this imputation of disloyalty and treachery. And in 2000, from 2000, it became so overt that at that point, I decided that we'd all been living in Britain as British Jews in a fool's paradise. There had been a kind of 50-year moratorium on the normal course of events, which was basically to disdain Jews or even hate them. And because of the discovery of Auschwitz and the extermination program, the genocide, it had all gone underground. And now Israel was providing people with an excuse once again to be anti-Jewish. And this was actually said to me by somebody who I'd previously held in high esteem, somebody with liberal credentials, but who had always struck me as very open-minded, somebody in journalism. And he said, "You've got this whole anti-Semitism thing completely wrong." And I said, "Why have I got it wrong?" And he said, "Well, what you have to understand is that after the war, none of us could say anything about Jews. And now we can again." And I said, "What? You're telling me that because now it's open season on Jews, this is a good thing?" And he said, "I didn't put it like that." And I said, "But that's exactly what you just said to me. The social disapproval of anti-Semitism has now been lifted by Israel providing you with the excuse to be horrible about Jews again, but you can sort of launder it through Israel." That's exactly what's happened. So, this has been a long, slow and painful process for me. Very painful indeed, because I'm British. I mean, Britain is what made me. It's part of my character, damp and wet. It's part of me. I'm not, and consequently, it's immensely painful. It's, as I said before, it's like a family. You suddenly realize that they've been abusing you.
Sure. And thank you for talking in such emotional terms, which I got you onto the subject because I heard a very similar discourse in Giles Fraser's podcast, Confessions, about your departure from the left of journalism via the New Statesman, The Guardian. Do you still have friends over there, or have you divorced the lot of them?
They divorced me.
But you've got no pals from that place anymore?
No, not from the left. No.
What do you say about the Jewish people, very high-profile Jewish people who are still in there? They have to suck all of that up. I mean, they do. There's no way else of putting it. They have to live that life in a kind of jimitude, in a way.
Well, indeed. Everybody reacts to this in their own way. And it is very striking that so many still are in what I would call a state of denial. But they are very often people who live fairly insulated lives. And they don't come across what I came across so much in personal terms, because they're not mixing in those sorts of circles. And the second point is that they are people very often for whom Israel is, as it was for me all those years ago, not part of their lives. These people are quite irritated by it because it keeps being thrust at them. But it doesn't really concern them. And if they think about it, they kind of agree that Israel really, does stuff that is is really bad. They've bought the lies. They're very often people who know zero about Jewish history, zero about the history of the Middle East, zero about the current situation in Israel in terms of the politics of the region. And all they know is given to them by the BBC and the mainstream media. And they are ignorant and prejudiced. They've bought a lot of the prejudices. So when they tune in to the Today programme, they don't react in the way that I react, with horror and revulsion and outrage at the lies that are being put over as truths about Israel. They just suck it in and they think it's true. And so that's a significant proportion. And then there's a proportion who do get it, but who are, moving is just not an option. I fully understand that. Moving is a luxury for many people. For many people, they are so entrenched through their work, through their family ties. It's unthinkable. In other words, the level of pain would have to be, and let's hope this never happens, but the level of pain would have to be, in order for them to consider moving, to consider their position was so bad they had to move, the level of pain would have to be inordinately higher, and let's hope that never happens. So I don't judge them. I mean, it's a matter of some regret that so many don't see it, and it's a matter of even more regret that the British Jewish community has always been, in terms of its leadership, very timid. As we know, they've always kept, heads below the parapet. And there are so many things they could and should say that would start to educate the rest of the country about the lies that are passing for truths. But they never say it. They never say them, partly because they actually believe the lies themselves, and they think that the truth is too extreme, or they do understand, but they take the view, which is very understandable, that it's not worth their while because of the punishment that will be inflicted upon them socially and professionally to tell these truths. And I fully understand that, and that is true. So they're silent. And this is a very tragic situation because people like me who come along and say stuff about the Palestinians' attitude, their anti-Semitism, for example, about the fact that Israel always behaves legally, regardless of what anyone else might say, I'm regarded as extreme. The bigger the truth you say in these circumstances, the more extreme you are painted. So Indeed. This is a matter of some regret.
Indeed, I have been punished bitterly this year for my stance on really being Jewish, actually. It was about the knee. I took a very similar position to you on that. I don't really want to talk about it too much because the podcast is about my guests, not me, but if you read the Jewish Chronicle, I've appeared on the front page a couple of times about Villa. And a bit like you, I was kicked out of a community, my city, where I thought I belonged. There are 189 fascists in the Holt End at Villa Park. That is the amount of people I've had to block. I never blocked anyone in my long and distinguished Twitter history before that. But they're in the club, they're in the first team, and it's painful. However, I still go on about love for Villa and love for football because when it's played without politics, it is a very beautiful thing until a final, until we take penalties. And then it becomes a point of agony again. How important, Melanie, is Israel to Jewish discourse and identity in the 21st century? Is the future cradle of Jewishness? What role does the diaspora have in our future? I'm going to use evidence A, which is the general and quite considerable decline in the Ashkenazi pronunciation of all prayers at shul. I was brought up with Ashkenazi pronunciations. It's dying out, and of course the whole culture is an Ivrit culture. Geigers into height. We won't be hearing that for very much longer either. But that is sort of figure one, evidence that really the future cradle of Jewishness is in the consensus of the 9 million people, 8 million of which are Jews who live in Israel?
Yeah, well, look, I spend most of my time now in Israel, which is in itself an extraordinary situation for me. Partly for that reason, because I think this is where we need to be properly Jewish. Now, I spent most of my life thinking that it was an absolute sacred duty to be a diaspora Jew. That we had a duty to be a light unto nations, to spread Jewish values. But I've changed my view, to put it mildly, and I now believe that in Britain Jews are, as they always have been, there on sufferance. However they parse it in their minds that they are equal citizens, they will never be. And I've come to realize that this is the Jewish condition. That the Jewish condition, if you read the Torah and you think about it, you read there, we are destined to be always on the other side. We are Ivrim. This is what it means to be on the other side, and we are a nation deliberately set apart. We are not to be counted. It's written in the great book. We are not to be counted as other nations. Now, this, of course, sends most British Jews and diaspora Jews absolutely wild. Because it's against everything they believe in. It's against everything I used to believe in.
Yeah.
But I do believe that it's part of Jewishness to be separate. And the idea that, we can ever be safe and secure in the diaspora is an absolute illusion. That's not to say everybody should basically pack up and come to Israel. It's not possible for vast numbers of people. But if you're asking what whether Israel is central, yes, it is absolutely central. This is where, Jews are Jews regardless of what people think of them. And it is a country set apart. There's no question about it. It is unique. And many Israelis can't bear this thought. Many Israelis, particularly, secular Israelis living in Tel Aviv, if they're young, I stereotype, but nevertheless, you get the point. Their whole thing is to be like everybody else in the world. They can't bear the fact, why should we be singled out? Indeed, if you come at it from a secular position, why on earth should they be singled out? Why should Jews be singled out? But we are, because we single ourselves out. So in Britain, you have a situation where, assimilation and the loss of the Jewish community is accelerating.
Yes.
In America, it's much, much worse. In America, 70% are liberal in their politics and liberal in, broadly speaking, the same people are liberal in their religious observance. And within a few generations, they are not. There's only going to be a small, very orthodox community. The Jewish community, as we know it in America, is simply dying. And in Britain, it's going the same way, but in a gentler trajectory. Yeah. So there's no future. There's simply no future. Even in the most benign circumstances, there's no future. Whereas I think of Israel as not just the center of Jewish life in the world, but I think of Israel, and people may find this a little far-fetched, but I think of Israel as potentially the last man or person standing in the West. Because if you look at the West, it is literally dying on its feet. Look at the birth rate. I can't give you the figures, but basically it is below replacement rate in Britain.
Italy's worried, for example.
In many countries in Western Europe and in America, it's either just about at replacement or just below replacement rate. Similarly, the Muslim world going off the cliff that way. Whereas Israel, 3-point-something children per woman, including in secular Tel Aviv. And this is a country, in Israel, it's a country which is optimistic. It actually believes it has a future.
Yes.
And so its birth rate is booming. Its economy, it's booming. Its happiness index is very, very high. This is extraordinary. Every family here in Israel, especially if they have a boy child, As soon as that boy is born, they know 17 years, and then we have to surrender him to the army, and we may lose him. Everybody lives with this, everybody. And a lot of people live with the bereavement of children who have died in the service of Israel. And this goes on without remission.
Yes.
And yet it's one of the happiest countries in the world.
Yes.
Because there's a sense of purpose, a sense of self-belief, a sense of collective endeavour. And it's extraordinary to come back to Britain, leave aside the corona crisis, but to come back to Britain where everybody lives in peace and plenty, where there are, 10 varieties of yogurt in the shops, where you have so much consumer choice it's coming out of your ears, where people are wealthy, where their children are not threatened by military service and dying in the cause of their country. And they have everything. And they're so miserable. Mm-hmm. And they're so cynical. And they see the bad in everything.
Yes.
And it's the most extraordinary contrast. And so I think something fundamentally is out of kilter, not just with the diaspora world, but with the rest of the world. And Israel is bucking the trend.
Indeed, I saw a wonderful picture of the chuppah, the wedding of Gilad Shalit, and thought, there was a man worth saving despite the huge cost to the stability of the country, because, as you say, he might produce a few men, or indeed women, children of the future, and maybe one of them will cure cancer or become the prime minister or just something brilliant, because that's what happens in the Israeli Jewish world. And then I dropped a note to Arnold Roth, because of course he was on the other side of that, and I said, I'm sure you'll be full of joy at the wedding of Gilad, but I'm just thinking of you today, because of course it was Malki that was one of the victims of the prisoner release, etc.
Yeah. I mean, Israel is one of the most dangerous countries in the world for a Jew to live in in that respect.
Yeah. So in Britain, as you have highlighted, we've experienced seismic changes in the Jewish demography. At the millennium, though, there was a little bit of an uptick, and the noughties as well, as French Jews in particular arrived in their thousands. Many are leaving now as the French-speaking nations attempt a Brexit land grab. Watch out for the stories about Paris making a really determined effort. I know those plans have been in place for about 2 or 3 years, and lo and behold, new office buildings are being built for a new class of former London employees going back to Paris, going to mainland Europe to operate in new de facto capitals where the access to the European Union will be attempted. Geneva as well. Our primary school is emptying out of a fair number of French Jewish people. But what is the future of Jews in Europe, Melanie? You're going to say the same thing, I think.
Well, it's a very serious outlook. I wasn't quite sure whether you were referring to French Jews going from London back to Paris.
They're doing it for expediency, for commercial reasons. The banks recognise that they need hubs in mainland Europe, and there is a land grab, and it's been negotiated. And even people who have British passports who are of French Jewish origin have been negotiating at the very, very highest level to bring Jewish homesick Jewish families who have lived well in London, who are doing great things. But globalization in the way that it was understood that they were brought here is over. I know we're having a global Britain, but that's going to look quite different to the globalized Tony Blair ideal, which is now very firmly gone. And these people are going home, for want of a better word. And we ain't going to replace them here, but they're going to have to live in Paris and in Geneva, which is obviously Switzerland and France, very, very different kinds of European nation. But they are going home in their hundreds.
Well, good luck to them. I mean, I wouldn't like to be a Jew in France or in many other countries in Europe. And this is going to get much worse, mainly through, anti-Jewish, the anti-Semitism in the Muslim community in various countries, which we've seen, especially in France, but also other countries, Sweden, the Netherlands. It's not going to go away. It's going to get worse. because it's being appeased. And people like me who speak about it are considered by the Jewish community leadership to be Islamophobic. So while you have, Jewish community leaders calling people who are drawing attention to the extreme danger to Jews from this tendency Islamophobic and prejudiced, and trying to shut them up and shut them down, the parlous position of these Jewish communities is going to get very, very much worse. So I think there is no future. I mean, having said that, Jews in the diaspora have always There have always been Jewish communities in the diaspora who have lived and indeed thrived in appalling circumstances.
Yes.
In Eastern Europe, some of the finest Talmudic scholarship came out of the most appalling circumstances of oppression. So, Jews cling on and survive regardless. So I wouldn't gainsay that. I wouldn't say that won't happen again. But everybody decides for themselves the level of discomfort or danger or pain that they can tolerate. Everybody makes that calculation for themselves. But looking at it kind of dispassionately, I would say, it's a very fraught future for the Jews of the diaspora in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Now, many of us have enjoyed your occasional appearances on BBC One's politics shows. I'm sorry, forgive me for laughing, but you'll understand as someone who sympathises with a great deal of what you say. It's good to get your opinion in on that channel. Why do they pick you? Do they pick you to make an example of you, or because no, we really should be hearing a wide spectrum of voices? We are, why do they pick you?
Well, as I've often said to the BBC, I am invaluable to them. Correct. As the acceptable face and voice of what they consider to be lunacy. Right. They've got to have it represented. Yes. And because they know there's a constituency that has to be represented. They have to be seen to be fair. And also, I'm good box office. I, bring in the ratings. And I can only assume that that's why they do it. But when I started speaking about Israel and anti-Semitism in the year 2000, I'd never spoken about it really before. To begin with, they kept putting me on the basis that I had to be heard. And I was always matched against an Arab or a Muslim or an Israel basher. Mm. Previously, I'd been matched against a left-winger. Suddenly, I became the Jew, and I became matched against one of those people. And then they stopped inviting me on. And they've gone to some lengths to avoid giving me any kind of platform where I might speak about these terrible, forbidden subjects. And so when I'm offered the opportunity, which happens sometimes by accident, I take it.
Yeah.
And the reaction is like, oh, whoa, we've got to stop her. And it's really quite amusing if you can stand back and see it as such. For me, it is agonizing. Yes. Because I'm up against such a prejudice. Yes. That you can't penetrate it. So the way I deal with it, what I've come to realize over many years of painful experiences of this kind, is that classically I'm in a studio or currently on Zoom, up against a BBC presenter and one or two guests or more who are virulently anti-Israel, anti-Jew, whatever it is. But what I have come to realize is that the people that I'm actually trying to reach are not the presenter and the guests. I'm not trying to convince them. Yes. I'm reaching the people down the tube watching the telly, because they write to me in great number and say, thank goodness you were there. And that's the point. On the sofa, people are watching carefully and listening carefully. And among other things, they're saying, I never heard that before. Is that true? Can you give me references? And you suddenly realize, they really don't know. Britain is full of really, really decent people committed to fairness, justice, the rule of law, being nice to others, and they've been hooked onto a narrative which turns it on its head. And they kind of know it's wrong, but they don't know why it's wrong because no one's telling them. And suddenly somebody comes along and gives them a few nuggets of information, and they suddenly realize, my goodness, we never knew that. Is there more? And it's tragic. When I find this, it's absolutely tragic because you realize then what we're all up against. So why these telly people keep doing this? I mean, you have to ask them. But basically, it's because I represent a constituency that they have to accommodate in some way.
Well done.
I guess.
Well done for being that person. And Joseph Cohen says the same thing. Israel Advocacy Movement, that fantastic broadcaster on YouTube. He doesn't do it to confront the people he's never going to win against, some really terrible people that he comes up against. He does it down the tube for the benefit of the decency of the people watching. He gets coverage in the Sun newspaper in terms of the constituency that you're looking at, the decency in Britain, etc. Now, Melanie, I was in synagogue the other weekend, and the rabbi at my synagogue talked about zeal, which I think's a great discussion, because the guy, it's Shlomo Levine, absolutely brilliant man. Very lucky to have him as the rabbi at our shul.
He says zeal gets a bad rap these days. He explained that zeal, the zeal that we're exposed to predominantly, particularly in the West, has a message of hate and division attached to it. Yet there is a zeal which could include compassion and love. And he then expands on it. We're all concerned with being middle of the road and, kind of this and that, and not tackling the things that need to be said or dealt with. Would the world be better off, Melanie, with zealousness which promoted love, not division?
Well, I'm torn because I'm British and I don't like zealotry. I suspect passion, but I am passionate in pursuit of my anti-zealotry, if you see what I mean. So, unpick that one.
Well, Winston Churchill, he gave us an example as a zealous man in the way that he was uncompromising about the Nazis. And we needed his zeal amongst the surrender monkeys around him.
I mean, I get very emotional about stuff that I care about very much, because I care about the consequences of what's going on the other side of the argument. But I am suspicious of emotion. I believe that we should always try to be rational and follow the evidence and keep emotion in check. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be committed and outspoken and dogged. Now, whether that's, I wouldn't call that zeal. I mean, I know exactly what Shlomo Levine means. And yes, one should be passionate in respect of promoting truth over lies and justice over injustice and so on. But that's fine in theory. But in terms of a person, I think if a person allows emotion to dominate reason, then I think you're asking for trouble, even if the cause is a just one.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The most amazing thing about this podcast is the lessons that I get taught by each and every guest, and the fact that I can have a conversation lasting nearly an hour, like the old days, in front of a fire. And I'm extremely grateful for this, Melanie. Thank you indeed for your time. And I have one more question for you, an unscheduled one. It's something I looked up this morning. It's a new novel out. It's called The Legacy. The mystery behind a recently discovered medieval manuscript holding the secret to the survival of the Jewish people. His name's Russell Wolfe. Is that a family name? Is there an Uncle Russell in the family? He's a faded TV producer. He's struggling with his father's death, deeply uncomfortable with his own Jewish identity. He's torn between anger with his father, estranged over Russell's marriage to a non-Jewish woman, and grief over their failure to reconcile. So it's not exactly autobiographical, but it must be somewhat around your world. Tell us about the book.
It's no one around my world, and it's everyone around my world.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a novel that I wrote in which I drew upon a whole variety of people and types that I'd met, and I wanted to get under the skin of anti-Semitism, and I wanted to do it in a way that knitted various things together that were important to me, and I'd never written a novel before. And amazingly, it sort of took over my brain. The characters sort of took up residence in my brain, and I now find it quite difficult to sort of sort out the fictional characters from the people I actually meet, because I have drawn upon various people that I know, and I never thought I could write a novel, and I did, and it was eventually published, and first of all, I've been very gratified by the readers who have read it and who've written to me and have said the thing that matters most to me of all, which is I couldn't stop turning the pages. And I thought, that's, what greater compliment can there be? But, that novel has had not one review.
Right.
Including in the Jewish press, which won't look at it, won't touch it.
Right.
Now, you have to ask yourself, why not? And everyone can fill in their own reason. But anyway, I was very glad to have written it. And, it enabled me to explore in some depth a lot of things that had been on my mind, but to do it creatively through characters that actually lived. And one of the things I wanted to do, which was rather ambitious, was to get inside the mind of an anti-Semite. And that's what I tried to do. And the central character, who is not the anti-Semite in question, the central character, this man, Russell Wolfe, draws upon a type in the British Jewish community, a type that have met many times, who is uncomfortable in his own skin as a British Jew, because there are tensions within being a Briton and a Jew, which he doesn't want to recognize and understand, and he has no idea that these tensions existed until he comes up against it, and then he can't deal with it, and then it changes him. It doesn't change my character in the way that it changed me, but it changes him. And that's what I wanted to explore, this process of painful change, and to see where such a character ends up. And this character is not me, and he doesn't end up in the place that I've ended up. And consequently, I've been assailed by various people, mainly sort of rabbis, who have said, "Oh, why did he do X? He should have done Y." And I said, but, that's the character. And they said, but you wouldn't have done Y. And I said, but the character isn't me. It's a character. He has a separate life from me. No, he should have done Y.
Well, it's great that they're talking it through. And if you want a review from the Jewish media, a must read, Jonny Gould's Jewish State. A real page turner. Actually, I must read it. I must read it, which I haven't done. Melanie Phillips, thank you so much for your valuable time and joining us here on Jonny Gould's Jewish State.
It's been a real pleasure, Johnny. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and good luck.
Never miss another Jonny Gould's Jewish State. And be first to hear the next show by subscribing now. Follow Jonny Gould on Twitter and Jonny Gould Show on Facebook. And if you liked what you heard today, leave a rating or review. That really helps bring more listeners to the show.